I want to make a distinction between two words that, at least when we look at them first, we would think that they are synonymous, that they're basically the same. But upon further examination, we will see a key critical difference between those two words. And those two include hopeless and desperate. Hopeless and desperate. Now, we can begin by saying, look, nobody wants to be in a situation that makes them feel hopeless or desperate. I mean, you can't feel good about your prospects, at least as it relates to a specific problem, when you're feeling either of those ways. But again, I maintain that there is a crucial difference. I want to start first with the hopeless individual. The hopeless individual looks at their circumstances and comes to the conclusion that the problem cannot get any better. There's no way things will improve, whether by their own strength or turning to someone else. There's no way that the situation can improve. And that conclusion, okay, whether they're correct or not, that conclusion leads them to inaction. It makes them inert, okay? And this shouldn't surprise us, because if you come to the determination, again, whether you're correct or not, that there's nothing that can be done to improve your situation, I mean, what's the point in acting relating to it? It would just be wasted activity, okay? However, when we turn to the desperate person, the key difference is the conclusion they make relating to their circumstance, related to their situation. Now, a hopeless person and a desperate person can be in the same exact situation, but they've come to different conclusions. Again, the hopeless person has already said, look, it can't get any better. But the desperate person looks at their circumstance, and there's something inside of them that compels them to move forward, compels them to act, even if it's some sort of a last-ditch effort to try to find some sort of deliverance, some sort of solution to their problem. And therein lies the key difference. We're going to be looking at two stories of people out of sheer desperation reach out to Jesus Christ and find that in response to that, Jesus rescues them. We're going to see that desperation isn't always a bad thing. We're going to begin reading in Luke chapter 8, in verse 40. Now, just before this, Jesus has been in the Gentile land of the Gerasenes. Many of you know the famous story where he cast out several demons from a madman, sent them into a herd of swine. And even though Jesus delivered these people from public enemy number one, they still don't appreciate him and they want him to leave. So he goes back to Galilee. Verse 40, and as he returned, the people welcomed him, for they had been waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue. And he fell at Jesus' feet. This is a great act of submission here. And he began to implore him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. Now, if we just take a first glance look at this introduction here, we would think, this is just going to be another story of Jesus being asked to heal somebody, Jesus being asked to perform a miracle, but not exactly. And that's down to a particular detail that Luke gives us about Jairus. Jairus is a synagogue leader. And one of the primary responsibilities of a synagogue leader is to make sure that people who came to this Jewish house of worship conform their lives to the Old Testament law. And in this Old Testament law, there was a big portion of it that spoke of purity codes, codes that would determine what was clean, what was unclean, what was pure, what was impure. All right? And how to move from a state of uncleanliness to a state of cleanliness. Now, this presents a bit of a challenge to Jairus. Well, why is that? Well, a big problem is that Jesus had a bit of a reputation of being someone who wasn't all that concerned with these purity codes. And when you go earlier in Luke's gospel, Jesus chooses to touch a leper in order to heal that individual. But we also know that Jesus has the power to speak a person into being healed, but he chooses to touch that person. That made Jesus unclean. In addition to that, he has compassion upon a widow because she's lost her only son. And as the funeral procession is coming through the streets, Jesus actually touches the platform that the dead son is being carried on. Look, that would pollute Jesus according to the Old Testament law. That would make him unclean. This reputation had to have preceded Jesus. And so Jairus is in a little bit of a quandary when you think about it, because how is he going to be able to call his own congregation to be faithful to this aspect of the Old Testament law and yet turn around and associate with this itinerant preacher who doesn't seem to be all that concerned with it? But he quickly makes a decision, or at least according to the text, it's a clear decision that he makes out of desperation. He's willing to set aside the hit that he's going to take on his reputation to reach out to Jesus so that his 12-year-old daughter might be healed. As Jesus is on his way to Jairus' home, he is interrupted by another person who's in a desperate situation as well. Those of you who are fans of literature will recognize this as an intercalation, meaning a story inside of another story, where basically another story inserts itself in and interrupts the progress of an ongoing story. What's the problem? We find a woman who's got a major problem. Goes beyond what you would think on the surface. Now, she has a hemorrhaging problem. She has a constant flow of blood type problem. Now, that sounds terrible on its own, and it is, but it's further complicated by the Old Testament purity codes. Why? She's in a perpetual state of uncleanness. Anytime a person is bleeding something out or discharging something out, for the most part from their body, they are considered ceremonially unclean. When a woman is going through her monthly cycle, she is considered unclean for a time. What's terrible for this woman is that she can't get well. And so because of that, if you turn to Leviticus chapter 15, beginning reading in verse 25, you will see that the blood has to stop for her to be considered clean. But it has to be stopped for a week, and then she can be declared clean. Now, think about the impact that this would have, not just on her physically, but on her socially as well. Where's her husband? She may not be married, probably not, and may never have been married as well. Why? Because everything she touches would be polluted, would be considered unclean as well. Where is her husband? It's a patriarchal society. Men have the authority. I mean, Jairus is there advocating for his 12-year-old daughter. There's nobody who comes forward to represent this woman, to beseech Jesus so that she might be healed. It's all up to her. Okay, so imagine if you are related to her or you want to interact with her. It's a very difficult thing to do because, again, going back to Leviticus 15, if you touch this woman or you touch anything that she has touched, you are considered unclean. And you have to wash your clothes, you have to wash yourself, and you're still considered unclean until the sun goes down. So that's got to be very detrimental to her opportunities to get married, to interact with anybody else. It would probably push her off to the margins of society. Now, some people have estimated, or at least thought, that the further you get away from Jerusalem, people may have relaxed their standards or whatever. But the fact that this woman was constantly unclean, it probably kept her from spending much time with anyone. It probably kept her out from the synagogue and kept her out from the mainstream of life. Now we're going to pick up reading back in Luke chapter 8, and we're going to begin reading in verse 43. In verse 43, where we get the introduction of this woman. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Now, Mark gives us a lengthier account, and it gives us some very important details, I think, that kind of give us a little bit more of a well-orbed, fuller picture of what's going on. Not only could no one heal her, this woman was financially ruined because of this situation. It says that she had spent everything she had, and instead of the problem getting better, it actually got worse. And according to Mark's gospel, this woman thought, you know what, if I can just get close to Jesus and just touch his robe, that will make me well. So that's what she's thinking there. And so she does come up behind Jesus, and she does touch the fringe of his cloak, and she is immediately healed of the flow of blood, immediately healed of the hemorrhage. Verse 45, and Jesus said, who is the one who touched me? I love this reaction. And while they were all denying it, it's like everyone's like, oh, I didn't touch him. Listen to what Simon Peter has to say. Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you. It's kind of like, Lord, Master, what are you thinking? There is a crowd of people crushing in on us, and you're wanting to know who touched you? Everybody's touching you, okay? But poor Peter, God bless him. He just doesn't know what's going on here. Jesus wants to take this as a teaching moment. Verse 46, but Jesus said, someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out from me. Verse 47, when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. Oh, God bless her. I mean, you have to keep in mind, those of us who are familiar with Jesus and grew up in the church, one of the first songs we sing is, yes, Jesus loves me. We know that Jesus is loving. How was this woman to know this? She probably just knew of his reputation as a great healer, okay? But who knows what she's thinking? Is she thinking that Jesus is going to rebuke her and say, how dare you touch me? I'm a holy man. I'm a great rabbi here. You have made me unclean. How dare you? That's not what he's thinking. But you could just see this woman just there before Jesus with great humility, just confessing, pouring her heart out to him. It's just a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. Verse 48, and he said to her, daughter, how about that? How about that? Daughter, not woman, daughter. The sense of you're with me. I care about you here. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Jesus knew what was going on here, but he didn't want the woman to think that his robe, his cloak, was somehow magical. He didn't want her to think that. He wanted her to know that out of her desperation, this faith that she is exercising. She could have been hopeless. She could have stayed at home. She could have thought, well, there's no hope for me. I guess I'm just stuck in this situation for the rest of my life. She had enough faith. She had enough trust to show up, to push herself through the crowd, opening herself up to being rebuked and reviled and called all sorts of names by other people. She exercises that faith and she gets to Jesus. That is what made her well. Now we have the opportunity to get back to the original part of the story about Jairus and his daughter who's near death. So I'm going to continue reading in chapter 8, but picking up in verse 49. While he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." If you're unfamiliar with this story, if you don't know how it ends, you can kind of get this sense, oh, Jesus, if you hadn't have delayed, if you hadn't have spent time with this woman with the hemorrhage, if you just would have let it go, let her be healed. You don't need to make a point that her faith made her well. If you just would have, picked your steps up and gone faster, you could have got there in time and you could have prevented this 12-year-old girl's death. I mean, that's what you set out to do in the first place. Situation seems pretty dire, doesn't it? Perhaps a better word for it would be hopeless. But in fact, what seems hopeless is not actually hopeless at all from Jesus. And he's going to make this point here in verse 50. But when Jesus heard this, he answered him, "Do not be afraid any longer. Only believe, and she will be made well." Now, in my last video, when I was speaking about John chapter 13, particularly in John 14, Jesus uses this verb pisteuo, which can be translated as I believe, I have faith in, I trust. And I think Jesus is making the same point. As terrible as the situation looks, you got to believe me. You have to put your trust in me. Things will be okay. All right, there's more than meets the eye here. Just trust me on this one. Verse 51, when he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the girl's father and mother. Now they were all weeping and lamenting for her. But he said, "Stop weeping, for she has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. He, however, took her by the hand. Jesus just can't resist himself, can he? I mean, he can tell her, command her to get up, rise, be healed, and she'll do it. But he chooses to touch her, which touching anything that's dead, according to those Old Testament purity codes, makes you unclean. So whammy, he's doubly unclean in these stories here. So he catches her by the hand and called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up immediately. And he gave orders for something to be given to her to eat. Her parents were amazed, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. Desperation is a terrible feeling. And even though it's to be preferred to hopelessness, it doesn't make you feel dramatically better. I believe one of the fundamental desires of all human beings is the desire for safety, the desire for security, and desperation works against that very desire. When you think about what leads a person to feeling desperate, the very thing that they want to uproot from their lives, counterintuitively, it can actually be used as a vehicle for leading a person towards greater wholeness, for leading a person to a greater connection with Jesus Christ. Dallas Willard is a philosopher who is once quoted as saying that God has an address and it's the end of the rope. I think that is a phenomenal quote and very, very true. Jairus was at the end of his rope. The woman with the hemorrhage problem, she was at the end of her rope. And it's difficult to conceive of them opening themselves up to humiliation and ridicule, going all the way after Jesus, if it was not for the desperation that was actually driving them towards him. So when we think about that, desperation could actually be a blessing. Now, I'm not going to give you examples of what desperation is, because if you're desperate, you know it. You feel it. You don't have to have anybody convince you of that. But whether it's you or someone else you know who's feeling desperate, I would just ask you to do the very thing that Jesus asked these individuals to do, or at least Jairus to do, to believe in him, to trust in him. And how do we do that today? We do that through prayer. That's our way of pushing through the crowds, getting through all the noise, getting through all the distraction, and approaching Jesus Christ. And so, like the woman with the hemorrhage, I think it's a good idea to pour yourself out to him, pour your heart out to him, and just leave it up to him and just see how he reacts to it. I think that could be the road to something wonderful in your life.